Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's do a little bit of a retro review or classic movie analysis. The movie tonight is going to be The Labyrinth, Jim Henson's 1986 movie starring David Bowie and Jennifer Connely and executive produced by none other than George Lucas. This is a really interesting movie, I think, to look at from a contemporary perspective because you can have a different view of how all of the effects work and the fidelity of the movie as well as its aesthetic system. Puppets obviously feature heavily, and we haven't seen a lot of puppet action since this movie. Jim Henson did two movies that were really super puppet heavy. Dark Crystal was the first one, and Labyrinth was the second one. Labyrinth, I think, was also like a box office failure, but since then it's developed a huge cult following, a cult following that's so big that there's books and I think there's follow-up movies that are based on Labyrinth, comic books. I know every year in Los Angeles there's a masquerade ball that's based on the masquerade ball from the Labyrinth that has been expanded lore-wise beyond what I would think is even possible. I may or may not have been to it at one point. But I think it's a really interesting thing to go back and look at a movie from the past and evaluate it in a critical light and sort of apply my system to it. Setup of the movie is pretty simple. There's a 15-year-old girl played by Jennifer Connely. She wishes for her brother. She has a baby brother. She doesn't want to take care of him while her parents go on a date. She wishes for the Goblin King to come and take her brother away. And miraculously he does, and she finds herself transported to the fantasy realm of the Goblin King, where she has 13 hours to solve the mystery of his labyrinth and get to his castle before he turns her brother into a goblin forever. That's the setup of the movie, pretty simple. Let's look at all the different categories. First category I like to look at is actually production, and production I'm going to look at three subcategories in it today. The first and most important one that I always look at is aesthetics. Aesthetics is sort of the entire design of the art, and most of the aesthetic system of Labyrinth is focused on the puppetry involved, and the puppetry involved is actually quite incredible. I think it holds up in many instances as puppetry especially, but if we look at it even for the time, the puppets that we saw were really, really cool. And we haven't seen puppets. We've seen puppetry used since then, but we haven't seen puppets used in this level of a movie really since Labyrinth. And it's easy to see why people kind of get attached to the aesthetic system that exists in Labyrinth. You have characters like Hoggle. You have these costumes that David Bowie wears that he seems to be the only person on the planet to be able to pull off. You have this ball, which of course inspires the Masquerade Ball in LA. There's a real lot of visual imagination that goes on in the Labyrinth, and it's kind of a nonstop feast in that sense of artistry if you look at it from that perspective. I give the aesthetics an 8 out of 10, and the reason they're not 10 out of 10 is that quite simply for every good piece, there's always in every scene a little bit that's lacking. The walls are quite plain, the environments are quite boring. While the puppets look good, there's not. We're kind of limited on the artistic expression of the sets themselves. So the characters are interesting, but the sets are quite boring. But the characters are interesting enough, and the overall design of it is interesting enough, I think, that it earns an 8 out of 10. And I think it's also, that's the main thing that people focus on. Just like how people really focused on the aesthetics of Star Wars, I think when it comes to the nostalgia factor of Labyrinth, I think it's the aesthetic design of Labyrinth that really carries the movie and really makes people be attached to it and remember it well. I think that's certainly what inspired, the Masquerade Ball type stuff that you see. So overall, 8 out of 10. If you look at it from a time perspective, obviously with the increase in fidelity that has happened over the last 20 or 30 years, like how much detail you're able to show on screen, it may seem like the aesthetic production is a little bit less than an 8, but you have to keep in mind this is in 1986, and I think it actually holds up pretty well, and there's some reasons for that. So let's move on to effects, and let's take a look at this first frame again with Jennifer Connely and the character Hoggle. The effects are kind of hit or miss, and I think they were kind of hit or miss at the time. The puppetry effects work really well, and one of the things that makes puppetry work well is that it's an actual physical object. I've talked about this in some other videos. when you have an actual physical object, an artist actually sat there and put the hair into Hoggle's head, and this is actually a dwarf wearing an electronically controlled puppetry outfit, so that articulates the face and everything. So there was an artist that put in every single wrinkle here, physically pressed it in, physically made the hair, and so the level of detail is just outstanding on some of these puppets, particularly Hoggle. The problem is that there's also sequences where the limitations of this puppetry design are quite apparent. First of all, although Hoggle looks amazing in this still, when you see him move, it's quite obviously a puppet. You have to suspend disbelief to believe that Hoggle is real. And the reason for that is, I've mentioned this in other videos, people are very good at evaluating human faces. And because we're very good at evaluating human faces, anything that's off about the animation of a face can really become very apparent to us. That's why CG of very human faces often looks a little bit off. And oddly enough, I think about the Warcraft movie, and the CG presentation of the orcs worked really well, and I think it was just not human enough that I found their expressions convincing. Whereas if we had a totally human face, like what we saw with Rogue One, kind of pressed on, and it moves in a way that even if I can't figure out every little detail of how it moves wrong or how the skin kind of stretches wrong, we know that it doesn't look quite right. It's in that kind of uncanny valley. The puppets don't really suffer from that, and as a result, it looks pretty good throughout. You'll also notice that when you have puppets and you have people in the same scene, the lighting is even and works for both. They blend much better than a lot of CGI with live actors, which is what we've had over the last 20 years. So the blending occurs much more naturally because you have a real object and a real person, and they just kind of fit together. There's never any of these scenes of like, oh, that's a CG object and that's a person, except for one scene, which is the Fireys, where they're like throwing their heads around. And this is a scene that was accomplished not with a green screen, but apparently a black screen, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I looked into the production of this particular movie, but I think they had a black screen, and they tried to superimpose a background after the fact, and it looks really bad. So if you watch it in 2018, you're going to be like, that looks really bad. It looks bad enough that it probably... I think there was some debate as to whether it ought to have been cut, but anyway, when you see it, you're like, I think maybe this could have been cut. That's how bad the level of special effects are. And it's not that all green screens look bad, but this one happened to be done particularly bad. And the reason they had the black screen is they have multiple puppeteers controlling different parts of the puppets. And so they're wearing black and hidden while it looks like the body parts are moving around. But that would look weird to just have black, so they put another, so the whole thing doesn't quite work out. At the same time, a lot of the puppetry effects, because they're not fully expressive, they do just look like, a moving object and not like what they're intended to represent. So there's a lot of limitations on the effects. I still give them a 7 out of 10 simply because of the time that they were made. This was as good as you were going to get for the time that they were going to be made, and a lot of them still hold up because they fit so well together with the human actors, which is interesting. And maybe I'll take a look at Dark Crystal as well, because I think that one doesn't have any human actors. So it'll be interesting to think about that one. It's a bit like comparing, if you were to compare this to like one of the newer Star Wars movies that uses CGI, you find that the objects interact with each other much better and are although it's clear it's a puppet, we know it's an object. We don't have a rejection of the belief that it's an actual physical object. Lastly, for the production part, music and sound. I actually give this a 5 out of 10, which is a mediocre score. The score overall, the actual score part of it is really good. The part that drags it down, so the orchestral score is awesome, but the songs do not hold up well at all. And there's this 80s trigger drum sound that they're always using that just it sounds way too retro at this point. It's like if you put it in Kung Fury or something, it would fit right in as a joke. You can only really enjoy it ironically at this point. David Bowie does a number of songs in this movie, and I'm actually a fan of David Bowie, and I really do not like the songs that he did in this movie, having watched this movie recently. I found them really cheesy. I didn't like the music. The scenes that contained those songs were incredibly awkward and cringy. Like he didn't know what he was doing when he was dancing. And I know that that's not officially part of sound, but it kind of goes into the whole emotional aspect of it, is every time there's a song that pops up, you just kind of want it to be over. So I don't feel like the songs held up well at all, while as the orchestral score is great. So if you were to split it off into songs and orchestra score, the orchestra score 9 out of 10, songs like 3 out of 10, but overall music and sound like 5 out of 10. I'm skipping sound design because it's not a super important part of this particular movie. So that makes the entire production score a 6.6 out of 10. That is a little bit below average. It's kind of mixed, mediocre. It's not bad. It's kind of mixed, and that's because that the sound part is not that good. Let's go on to story. Story is actually definitely the weakest part of this movie by far. Going back and watching it, I realized there really isn't much of a story here. So I like to break things down usually into just characters and plot. In this case, I'm going to include setting. Because the setting is so integrated into the idea of what Labyrinth is, I'm going to evaluate it on its own. I give the setting a 7 out of 10. It's a very interesting setting. It's visually interesting. The characters we see in it are interesting. The dynamics between them are kind of interesting. The entire world that they craft is enough that I kind of want to see more of it. But they don't really do much with it. So the setting's a 7 out of 10. Go on to the characters and the acting. I actually give these a 5 out of 10. All the characters are essentially caricatures. Hoggle is a really good character. He has a little bit of an arc, and he's kind of a fun character, but most of the other characters are kind of throwaway. You have characters that don't talk. You have characters that are essentially Don Quixote riding a dog, which is quite funny, but gets a little bit old. Then you have David Bowie as the Goblin King, and while he looks the part expertly, he does not act the part that well. He doesn't really act that much at all. He kind of glowers and tries to overact, but the performance just doesn't really hold up, although I think the costume and the look certainly supports his presence in the movie. Jennifer Connely, likewise, her character Sarah, she mostly comes off as annoying. She's not a very likable character. She's very whiny at the beginning. She doesn't have any growth really until the very, very end of the movie, and that really kind of sells the character short and makes you not really root for her as much as you probably want to. So that's unfortunate. The characters, they're 5 out of 10. Maybe that's kind of in the middle, going towards like pure failure, but it's essentially a mediocre presentation of the characters. Now, the plot. This is the real weak point of the movie, because there really isn't a plot. There's a conflict, then there's a bunch of random scenes that happen, and then there's a resolution at the end. And the resolution at the end is exactly the resolution you knew had to happen from the beginning, with maybe one slight twist. So you have this character, Sarah. She's home late. She doesn't want to interact with stuff. She doesn't want to grow up. At the beginning of the movie, we don't get this strong sense that she doesn't want to grow up, except for the fact that like her room's full of kind of childish stuff. She is upset with her brother having her teddy bear, I think, and so she wishes him to be gone. That creates the main conflict of the movie, which is, I'm going to turn your brother into a goblin. It's like, I don't want you to turn him into a goblin. And the reason she doesn't want him to be turned into a goblin is essentially not clear at the beginning of the movie, and it kind of sort of becomes clear at the end. So she kind of sets off on this journey without a clear reason not to, except she feels guilty about having done it, I guess. When she enters the labyrinth, she meets lots of fantastical creatures. All the scenes are very interesting. They're all fun. There's lots of each one is an individual little story, is kind of fun. But as a whole, they contribute nothing. And they don't really do anything except for a few scenes with Hoggle. Jennifer Connelly's character doesn't grow at all. She essentially bumbles her way all the way to the end of the labyrinth, not really of her own accord, and then kind of realizes that she has to grow up, and that's how she's going to overcome the Goblin King, and maybe she was imagining it the whole time. So that's basically how the plot works. There isn't really a plot, and that's the big downside. There's events that happen, and none of them are consequential. There's characters you meet, and none of them are consequential. They just kind of become They kind of become Sarah's friends. Nothing really does anything, and the fact that we are in this fantasy world, all of her actions really have no consequence, and because we kind of think she's imagining it, we still believe that there's really no consequence, there's no danger involved in it, and so there's no real tension. We have an idea that, you got to reach the castle in 13 hours. That's the conflict. We know that she's going to succeed because that's pretty much what the movie does, and it doesn't throw us any hooks that make us reevaluate that end goal. She gets to the end. There's some awkward things that the Goblin King says about, like, I love you and stuff, and then essentially she accomplishes the plot goal. So that's really the weak point. I give it a 3 out of 10 because it does have a primary conflict and it does have a resolution, and the scenes within the movie are interesting, but there's really not much story, not much plot. So overall, the story is a 5 out of 10, which is mediocre to bad. Lastly, last category, general effect. This is how I generally feel about the movie. I actually give it a 7 out of 10, and that's because I think it's kind of enjoyable to watch puppetry, and it's enjoyable to watch all these different weird scenes, even the ones with really bad green screen effects. I don't think they actually used a green screen. I think they tried to. It's interesting to watch these with all these different effects, and they're fun, and the characters are kind of fun and silly, and when they attack the Goblin Town, there's lots of fun little things that happen. So overall, I give it a 7 out of 10 because each of those individual scenes is quite a bit of fun, but you could watch them kind of abstracted from the plot, and you wouldn't really lose anything with the effect of the scenes. So that makes the overall score a 6.2, which is lower than some people would give it, but I think if you actually sit down and evaluate what's in the movie, there's a reason that it wasn't so successful and critics didn't particularly love it at the time, and I think it mostly has to do with the story. The story's quite weak, and the characters can be a little bit annoying. There's definitely a lot of flaws, but its good points are really good, and I think that's a testament to the strength of, if you make something in a movie with one thing that's really awesome, that one thing can kind of carry people's opinion on it. Now, I'm going to make one more note about the music and sound. It's going to vary by taste, depending on whether you like those David Bowie songs. I mentioned I like David Bowie. I should say I didn't like these songs by David Bowie, and I don't know why that is, but I don't feel like they hold up at all. They're not very interesting. I don't really like his performance on them. So if you liked those, obviously this movie may get a little bit higher score, and it may get a lower score if you're looking at the effects from a purely 2018 perspective and you're comparing it to modern technology, because the puppets are not as convincing as perhaps modern animation might be, but that's going to be kind of up to you. I'm not judging it quite on those standards. I'm comparing it to how well it holds up and how good things look in general, and how well it looked for the technology of the time as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little analysis, and it's been kind of fun. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear down below. Quite a fun little movie, Labyrinth. Most of you have probably seen it. Let me know what you think about it. Do you think my evaluations were accurate, and how would you rate something different within all those scores that I gave? So have a good one, and I'll see you next time.